We're talking about education today, and education is such a powerful aspect of all of our lives. We spend so much time, particularly those 12 years in mandatory, primary, junior high, and high school years. What our experience is there, particularly from early on, how our teachers think about us, how we think about ourselves in terms of ability to learn and comprehend, etc., affects our whole lives. And it's often, I think, by most people overlooked area of socialization and that idea of who we are and what we're capable of and how we operate in the world. And much of that has been imposed on us by others, and that has to be overcome as we become adults. And it's hard to overcome, and many of us you can't do it if you're not aware of it to begin with. And B, it's a difficult process, but it can be done, by the way. And I'm sure many of you are learning that and discovering that in your journey with higher education. So what is education? It's a social institution that transmits attitudes, knowledge, beliefs, values, norms, and skills. Now think about this. In that definition, there's only two words that apply to what you might call actual learning, education, and that is skills and knowledge. The other words in the definition are attitudes, beliefs, right? Values, norms. And those are usually the most important things that we learn in school, depending on who we are. It may be the skills and the knowledge are, very low on the ladder or the scale of what we actually learn in school, as you'll see. And education can be formal or informal, and it can occur in a wide variety of settings. The way children learned historically, before there were schools that were kind of universal schools, and certainly before they were mandatory, is from watching, being, and doing with parents and other adults. So that's how you learn to cook. I'm doing female things now, traditionally female things, but that's how you learn to cook. That's how you learn to sew. That's how you learn to take care of babies. And animals, and that's how you learn how to fix cars if you're a guy. And once again, I'm being very gender stereotype, but I just am trying. Many of those traditional cultures where people learned these things were, and so you learned from doing. You learned from observing. I've felt it's been interesting to me to see what's happened with kids not being in school and being home, and there's such an opportunity for learning, but parents have to feel comfortable that they have something to teach and to transmit. So it's just, there's all kinds of, you can learn math from cooking, you can learn you can learn, science and biology from gardening and planting seeds. There's just all kinds of things that are there as a richness to learn from, but you have to know that, and you have to feel comfortable doing it. But as before school, I just want you to know that's how kids learn. Okay, so that's what we just talked about, was education. Schooling is a narrower term, and that involves and means formal training and instruction provided in a classroom setting. So technically, when you go to school for 12 years, you, from these definitions, I kind of love this, aren't necessarily getting an education. You're getting schooling, okay? So the U.S. education/schooling system, there's been four major changes in it since the beginning of the 20th century. And the first is that mandatory universal education. You know, if you don't send your school, there'll be consequences. Some form of school. I mean, you can homeschool now, but you have to jump through the hoops and prove that you're doing it and that progress is happening, et cetera, et cetera. So when mandatory schooling was first happening, it was 8th grade that was the required level that people needed to go to. Interestingly, if you look back at the curricula and what people knew in writing, they actually learned more in those 8 grades than now happens with, 12. But we'll get into that later. That has a lot to do with the quality of education and that type of thing. So that's the first aspect that's changed of American education schooling since the beginning of the 20th century. The first is universal mandatory education. The second is that community colleges have flourished. And look, here you are in one. They were a relative. There was one or two at the beginning of the 20th century, but they've just grown by leaps and bounds and flourished. And that growth of them started in the late 50s. The third is that their public education is much more available to you. So it used to be private colleges and universities were what people went to, because so can you see how only the wealthy and the elite went to college, because it's not cheap to go to Yale, Harvard, Dartmouth, Princeton, right? But the growth of public higher education, I'm not talking about community colleges now, I'm talking about Portland State University, Oregon State, University of Oregon, to use Oregon schools. Those state schools, which have a much lower tuition rate than do the private colleges, they have grown and flourished. And then the fourth big change is that the increase in diversity of people who are attending colleges. Remember, women couldn't attend college initially. And then, they slowly made inroads into various aspects of college, but they couldn't go to med school for years and years and years. It wasn't that long ago that women were not admitted to medical school, for instance. So women have increased in education, and racial and ethnic groups have increased as, being able to attend college. The result of these changes is that now there's a record number of Americans that have completed high school. 90% of Americans have completed high school. And those that have obtained a bachelor's degree or higher of Americans is now 34%. I think, it was 10% at the most, maybe at the beginning of the 20th century. Another aspect that is not mentioned in this section of the changes, I think we get to it later, but is economics. If you want to make a good living in America, unless you're going to be, a sports star or a media star of some kind, you need to have a college degree to have a living wage. It's unfortunate, but that's one of the major changes that's occurred. So that's important too. And that's why there are so many more people in college and getting college degrees than there were historically. So from a functionalist perspective, education, well, they apply this to all aspects of whatever they're looking at, family, religion, politics. But from this, looking at it now, there's a manifest function of education and latent functions of education. The manifest functions are the stated functions. That's why they're manifest. They're clear. They're not hidden. Latent are the unstated, somewhat hidden functions of something. So the manifest functions, let's go back to those two words from the description that or the definition I just talked about, knowledge and skills. So reading, writing, and arithmetic are, the manifest functions of why you're in school. Is that the important stuff you learn? Usually not. It's the latent functions that are so powerful of what you learn. There's some manifest functions that are pretty powerful too. But the key point here is that schools are what are called socialization agencies. This is what I was saying from the very, when I first started talking about this today, is the power of socialization that happens in schools, both in our personal self-concept, but also in what we learn about the societal rules. So one of the things we learn, in fact, we talk about that this kid who's isolated at home, we're using that terminology all the time now with COVID and kids not going to school, they're not getting any socialization with other children. And so one of the things you learn in school is it teaches you how to get along with others, and it prepares one for adult economic roles. So schools, these are the major functions here. It transmits knowledge and culture. These are manifest, stated functions. Transmits knowledge and culture. So you learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. It also instills cultural values, doesn't it? And our cultural values in the West are things like competition and achievement and democracy, which is a nice one. Competition, think about this. When I don't know if they still do this in elementary school, but when I was in elementary school, there used to be a chart by the classroom door with all the students' names on it. And by the good students' names, whether it was for attendance or turning in homework or getting whatever, there'd be gold stars, right? And that was there for everybody to see. So you knew who the smart kids, the good kids were like that. And you knew who the ones who weren't were immediately as well. Sometimes there'd be, other things that identified kids in the middle, maybe blue stars instead of gold stars. I don't know. But you get the point. When it's public like that, that is encouraging competition. It also encourages a lot of people to give up. But if you buy the cultural values, it encourages competition. So that's another aspect of it. And it increases, we're talking about the public mandatory education. It increases cultural integration. So you make social bonds with each other. And there in many schools, there's something called a social cohesion. You see this mostly in sports or other kinds of competitions where everybody's rah-rah for that particular school. That's social cohesion. So it gives us our first taste of that, in a sense, growing up. Schools promote cultural innovation. When you get to higher ed, you've got research coming out of, amazing faculty doing research in universities and developing treatments for diseases and developing new technologies and looking in courses like anthropology and sociology, social problem solutions, coming up with solutions to social problems, or at least understanding them better and research about them. And education from this functionalist perspective benefits taxpayers because the more highly paid a population you have, the more taxes you are collecting. And so that then taxes are used for public benefit, theoretically, and in many cases that's true. Roads, education, libraries, healthcare, and that type of thing. So from a functionalist perspective, education, quote, pays off. So, and most Americans say that college is very, very important. And when they do the research, 88% of college students say that their reason for going is to get a good job. And 74%, I'm glad to hear this, that 74% of them say that college helped them to grow intellectually. I wish those were reversed, those figures. But whatever. Okay. I'm glad to hear that 75% of college students say that it helped them grow intellectually. College definitely increases earnings, as I'm sure you know. College graduates have a 60 to 80% higher annual income than do those with a high school diploma. So over the lifetime, college affects earnings 5 times more than any other demographic factors like sex, race, ethnicity, or age. By age 64, those with a bachelor's degree earn 6 times more than those with a high school diploma. Also, people with bachelor's degrees live longer, regardless of race, ethnicity, or family background. They have better emotional and physical health and handle stress better. Let me explain why here. They have more options. You can go to a treatment center because you have health insurance. You can go to an inpatient treatment center. You can go to a therapist. You have options to handle stress. You can go to fancy yoga classes, whatever. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So income in our society, in a capitalist society, gives you more options and opportunities to take care of yourself, to eat healthier food. That's one of the reasons they live longer. Okay, both education about diet, but also being able to afford to eat well. Okay, and here's a really key part. People with bachelor's degrees and higher hold jobs with a greater sense of accomplishment. They have more autonomy in their jobs. And, you know, most middle-class jobs with degrees do not require punching a time clock. That's an aspect of autonomy. You are trusted. You are treated like a grown-up to be at work when you're supposed to be at work, etc. There's not as much authoritarian checking up on you in jobs that require college degrees. Generally, there are, of course, exceptions, but in general. Now, those are the manifest functions. What are the latent or not so obvious or hidden functions of mandatory education and consequences as well? Well, first of all, a number one, which we're seeing again in the COVID epidemic, is there are places to park your kids, their daycare, basically. And many schools have after-school programs. Many of them have early morning programs. They have feeding programs, free lunch and free breakfast and that type of thing. So in an economy where both parents are working, they're without this function that is not a stated function of education is, you know, a glorified daycare system in a sense, okay? They are also matchmaking institutions. It's where often in high school we have our first romantic relationships, and used to result in a lot of marriages in high school. Now it's more from college, but you know, that's one of the things that it does. It brings together unmarried young people. It also, a latent function, it decreases job competition because the longer you lock people up in young people up in educational situations, then there aren't as many people competing for jobs, for the available jobs, because they're in school. They're not competing for the jobs yet. So that's another aspect of it. Another latent function is it creates social networks for people, which can eventually lead to jobs and opportunities from people that you meet in school. And it's good for business. There's thousands of businesses. Think about the tutoring, testing, you know, textbooks, all the people employed in terms of faculty and counselors, et cetera. So education and keeping people in school is also good for business. Now, the critical evaluation of functionalism and the way that it looks at education that we just described is, you know, do they exaggerate the benefits of it? Well, the answer is yes. Okay. So if you look at this, about 35% of the world's billionaires, so over a third, don't have college degrees. Now, I know that's in the text, but those are people that have are unique in the way in terms of the skills or their inventive capability or whatever that they have. Another criticism is that some relatively high-paying jobs only require a 2-year degree or a 2-year certification Things like radiation therapists, dental hygienists, commercial pilots, etc. Those are all pretty high-paying jobs that don't require 4 to 6 to 8-year degrees. And of people who have bachelor's degrees, 40+% of them say that the job they're currently doing doesn't really require a college degree. I mean, it requires it legally, in terms of job description, but the work, what they're doing, doesn't, utilize what they learned in college at all. And so, of course, this is we know this, that what people study affects their salary. And also, that's another criticism. If you're going to med school, your salaries are going to be much, much, much higher than if you're getting, a 4-year degree in education, say. So that's where the what people study affects their salaries. And then the last criticism of this is that, and it's true of functionalism in every category that we apply it to, really, or every institution, it tends to gloss over the dysfunctions of the institution. Things like rising costs, certainly student loan debt, et cetera, et cetera. So now let's take the conflict theory and look at this. The conflict theory's question about education is, does it perpetuate social inequality? And the answer from a conflict perspective is yes, it certainly does. So social class, race, ethnicity, and the achievement gap. The difference in academic performance that shows up in grades, standardized test scores, and college completion rates shows a huge achievement gap, based on social class and race and ethnicity. So people didn't really know this or understand it until there was this surge of minorities who started attending colleges. And so we look at then you can look at graduation rates based on gender and race and ethnicity and social class. Well, Asian Americans have the highest graduation rate. There's a figure 3.2 in your text that demonstrates all of this. So they have, for instance, Asian Indians, people from India, have an 87% of them have at least a bachelor's degree who go to college, those who matriculate to college. And I might have said it in this class, I don't know, but it just amazes me, because I watch a lot of news, how many of the doctors that are interviewed about the epidemic are Indian, are East Asian from India. It's just, and so many of them are women, East Asian women. It's truly incredible. Okay, so when you look at other minorities, one of the most important things has to do with social class within minorities. So not all Asians, we were talking about East Asians, have an 87% graduation rate, bachelor's degree. But within the different categories of East Asians, the Hmong, the Samoans, it drops down much lower. So, and so the most important characteristic in race and ethnicity is the social class of the group. 50 years ago, the gap for achievement was between African Americans and whites, but now it's between social classes. And the gap between high and low income families in educational graduation rates has grown by 40% since the 1960s. So the cumulative reasons for the achievement gap, one of them was the 2008 recession. That reduced funding, and it was really a depression, but nobody wanted to call it that, so they called it the Great Recession. It reduced the tax rates and fundings to schools because they get funded through property taxes, right? As well as higher ed gets funded through other forms, but elementary and high schools and all that get funded through property taxes. Whatever, it's still, if it's a public school, there's a tax base involved And so when there's fewer taxes being paid because fewer people are working and there's an economic crisis, then there's a reduction in funding to schools. So class sizes increased, but staff positions and teachers did not increase. So became much bigger classes than you can teach effectively. Now, of course, the wealthier communities voluntarily increased their taxes to keep their schools excellent, which they are in wealthier communities. The public schools are. So that was a huge social class difference. And then many schools have high levels of what's called double segregation, where kids are separated not just by race and ethnicity, but by social class, by income as well. So if you think about this, it's just horrible. Because schools are funded by property taxes, schools in wealthy communities have wonderful schools, and schools in poor communities don't. Okay? So if you are poor, you generally live in a low-income area or neighborhood to be able to afford the rent or purchase price of a home. So 40% of African American students attend high-poverty public schools, compared with 6% of white students. So what they get are less experienced teachers, less qualified teachers, a very high turnover rate in teachers, inadequate facilities. So there's ancient or no computers, ancient or no textbooks, very high dropout rates, falling apart buildings, and also danger. Many of those schools have metal detectors for guns as you go to school. Well, that's kind of a scary way to go to school, every morning. So that's a double whammy of double segregation by race and ethnicity and by social class. So poverty and inferior schooling leads to really significant roadblocks in a path to a better life. It really does. So first of all, schools in poor areas are much less likely to offer high-level math courses and science courses. What's the ticket to ride today for jobs? It's STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. So if your school is less likely to offer courses in those fields that are beyond the very basic stuff, then that's not preparing you for going on to college and taking those courses. And so not having those kinds of high-end courses in STEM in poor high schools means that it's the difference between passing and failing required college courses during the first years of college, the first couple of years, when many of those higher math or science courses are required for a degree. And even when top students from low-income high schools enter colleges that have selective requirements, they struggle to maintain passing grades. So even if they made it through those, grade point average requirements to get into colleges, they still struggle to maintain passing grades. And because, for one thing, often they're having to work part-time or do other things other than just go to, do their college courses, and they tend to have more stress. So now let's look at education and social control. So conflict theorists say education, rather than helps upward mobility of people, which is what the functionalists say, conflict theories say, no, it actually restricts or limits upward social mobility because of the three things: the hidden curriculum, credentialism, and privilege. So what is the hidden curriculum? This is the latent, hidden aspect of education, okay? The hidden curriculum are school or educational practices that transmit non-academic knowledge, such as values, attitudes, norms, and beliefs. Transmitting that in an educational setting legitimizes those ideas, like competition is good and capitalism is the only economic system worth thinking about, and those types of things. Okay, so it legitimates, and what it does is then it legitimates economic inequality. Well, those people just didn't work hard enough that are poor, they're not smart enough or whatever. Okay, so it legitimates economic inequality and the staffing of unequal work roles, which means those people who can't, cut it in school, work the lower end jobs. And that's part, from a conflict perspective, that's part of what's going on with education. Okay. Another aspect is that schools in low-income neighborhoods tend to stress obedience, following directions, and punctuality. Those are all characteristics that are needed. Remember I said about punching the time clock? Those are all characteristics that are needed in jobs that are low-paid jobs, where you have to punch time clock, where you don't have any autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. Schools in middle-class neighborhoods, that's low income. Middle class emphasize proper appearance, behavior, cooperation, conforming to rules, deference to authority. And those students, many of them from the middle class, will go on to college and to work in bureaucracies where those characteristics are important and will help get you hired. Now, in upper class schools that have very high standards for entering those schools, they're called selective standards. That's usually grade point average. What have you done in community service? You have to write personal essays to get in, et cetera, et cetera. Those schools have many more applicants than they take for, admission to the college. So what they encourage is leadership, creativity, independence, people skills. Those are all highly prized characteristics in elite circles. And so for jobs at the very top, CEOs, creative types in advertising agencies, those types of things, that's the kind of skills you want to have. So can you see, I'm sure you can, how that hidden curriculum channels people into different roles. It reinforces and reproduces the existing social class structure, and it provides workers for jobs and occupations in the stratification of those jobs, the low-paying jobs, the middle jobs and the upper jobs. And the saddest thing is that often this is based on, well, first of all, you can't get into the elite institutions unless you have straight A's and, a 4-point and have done a lot of community service and stuff. But it also, a lot of it is based on teachers and institutions' assumptions at earlier ages of who you are and what you're capable of, how you get channeled into these different categories. So that's the hidden curriculum. Credentialism, have you ever noticed, it says this, I've got one of my degrees up behind me on the wall. When I had my office at SWAC, when I was full-time, I had various degrees up and certifications and things of that nature. And we all do that. Doctors do that. People with college degrees put them up on the wall. Law degrees are up on lawyers' offices' walls, etc. It's a credential to prove, hey, we know what we're doing. We paid our dues. We went to school. We got the degree. That's what credentialism means. So from a functionalist perspective, credentialism is great because it rewards people for their accomplishments, for getting through school, getting their degree, whatever the educational path is. But the conflict theorists say this: for many positions, you can gain skills on the job within a few weeks training, or you can succeed because of your ability or other factors. But you'll never get a chance to prove that or find that out in many cases because you have to have the degree first. Okay? And so and this is more conflict theory, due to a large supply of high school graduates, employers can now demand college degrees for jobs that really you don't need a college degree for. Remember, 41% of people who had jobs, who had bachelor's degrees, said they didn't really need a degree to do that job. Okay, well, this is an example of that. So employers will now demand college degrees, even though the jobs don't need it. So retail, law enforcement are examples your book gives you, and that's called credential inflation. Okay, requiring people to have degrees for jobs that don't really require them. And as of course, and part of the reason that can happen is that the more people get degrees, the value of them is diminished. So now the kind of jobs you get with a bachelor's degree is the equivalent of the kind of jobs a generation or two ago you got with a high school diploma. Now you really need an advanced degree, a master's at least, to go on to professional type of work. Generally, I don't mean to discourage you, but that's just a general fact. So and then privilege is the third thing that the conflict theorists look at with education. And this is a quote from your textbook. We're the only rich nation to spend less on educating poor kids than we do on educating kids from wealthy families. And when you look at this, I had seen that in an article several years ago, maybe 5 years ago, that we spend much more on educating the wealthy of tax dollars and things of that nature, grants and things, than we do scholarships, than we do on educating poor kids, which is just the opposite of all the other wealthy industrialized nations. So although many colleges say that they're committed to diversity, that's not easy to say, right? And including low-income students as part of that diversity, not just racial, ethnic, and gender diversity, but social class diversity. In 2010, 2011, colleges awarded $5.3 billion in financial aid to students from high-income families. So the higher, and I checked about today, and I didn't get a figure, but it said that higher income families borrow more money for college than do low income families. Students with a 3.5 GPA or higher and white students receive 3 times more in merit-based scholarships as minority students. That's taking minorities and whites, both, that had equal GPAs, 3.5, the white students received 3 times more scholarships than the minority students. Among students with similar GPAs and SAT scores, the high-income students receive scholarships from colleges, federal or state governments have increased. And then if you look at legacies are for children of alumni who have attended Ivy League colleges, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, etc. And usually those alumni have contributed large amounts of money to the school, and their kids just get in without having to go through all that admission nonsense. The example, I'm so glad that the book gave you this example, which is George W. Bush. Could any of you get into Yale with a C- average? Well, of course not. No one could, okay? Except George Bush did, George W. Bush. Because back to his grandfather, or maybe great-grandfather, were alumni of Yale, have given millions of dollars to Yale, and so he was ushered right in. So there you go. That's what legacies can do. Now, what's the critical evaluation of conflict theory? Well, for one thing, one of the good stories coming out of education recently is that diversity in community colleges, racial and ethnic diversities, has increased about 56% at community colleges and at four-year universities. So it's happening. I do have to say that the graduation rate is still, or the completion rate, I should say, of degree programs is still lower in those categories. Um, and they overstate the value of social class. Well, or the importance, I should say, of social class. Um, and the question being, is it social class, which is what the conflict theorists are criticizing, or is it social cultural values? Well, if you look at Asian cultures, yes, it's cultural values, the great respect for education, for teachers. Teachers are really honored in East Asian and Asian cultures. Um, but it's intertwined because those cultural values mean that people are going to get higher education, means they're going to be a higher social class. So it's the chicken or the egg kind of thing. Feminist theories. Is there a gender gap in education? It's interesting when you look at this in detail, where the gender gap lays, actually. So since 1992, women graduate from college at higher rates than men. And what now the gender gap people are looking at is it for males, that there's a gender gap because there are a male crisis, and it's called the feminization of higher education. So who's getting degrees? Well, it's about equal in gender for high school. And then women get more associates and bachelor's degrees. But after bachelor's degrees, women's percentage drops considerably for after the bachelor's degree, for postgraduate degrees, masters and doctorates. And often people are going, oh, what's wrong? What's happening with women? Well, part of it is you can postpone marriage and childbearing to a certain extent. And and that length of time is that women are getting married and men. The age of marriage is increasing. The age of having your first child is increasing, but the biological clock starts running out. You start getting pressure from family. There's a variety of things that happen to women after that additional 4 years minimum of getting a bachelor's degree. When things start happening, the pressure is just too great to continue in school full time. Socially, their own bodies, a variety of other things. So that's primarily the research I've looked at that is the cause for that drop in graduation rates with masters and doctorates for women when they've been the majority of bachelor's degrees up until then. So across all racial, ethnic, and gender groups, students from affluent families are more likely to obtain bachelor's degrees. And why do women attain more degrees up to master's levels? Well, in high school, and this is all based on research, in high school and college, women study more than men, they get better grades, they hold more leadership positions, and they're more involved in clubs and community work. They're also, when you ask them in research, more likely to value higher education. 81% of women, when they're asked, greatly value higher education, whereas 60% of males say they do. They are also less likely to drop out of school and join the labor force than men. And now many colleges are giving men preferential admissions to avoid the gender gap, getting a larger gender gap in undergraduate programs. What about majors and careers, where women are underrepresented in most of the very high-paying positions, which now, as I said earlier, are the STEM careers: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. By the way, everything I'm saying is based on research, and the citations are in the text. So it's not just, somebody thinks this. So in elementary and high school, boys and girls take about the same amount of math and science courses. And about the same number, this is so interesting, about the same number plan on taking the STEM courses when they get to college. But after a few years, men far outnumber women in those courses. in nearly every STEM field. In mathematics, engineering, and computer science, women earn only 10 to 20% of the bachelor's degrees, and numbers decline further at the graduate level and in the workplace as well. So why is that? Well, women start out as persistent as men in the STEM major, and they even earn higher grades initially in those classes. But they become less satisfied with the core courses and they become more likely to doubt that they can succeed in male dominated disciplines of the STEM courses as they go through them. Their self-confidence begins to falter. They change majors. They also have few female faculty member role models in STEM. That is so important. The vast majority of faculty in STEM courses are male. And some male professors just won't even mentor female students. They view them as less competent, in that field. So that's some important reasons why that's happening with women. What about symbolic interactionism? That's, the last theory we're going to look at. So how does social context affect education? What are the roles, student-teacher roles? Those are both socially constructed. They're constructed very differently as I just mentioned, in Asian cultures. Teachers are glorified, elevated, paid well, all of those things in Asian cultures. And because of that, students are extremely respectful and, aren't on their phones during class and don't, they pay attention, et cetera, et cetera. So those are socially constructed roles, both teacher and student. And education, and I really like this, and that's what I miss in class so much, having class, is that it's active, interactive. It's a process that includes students and teachers and peers and parents and the setting and all of those things, but also in non-college, prior to college, there's tracking and labeling that occurs, and those are two very negative things that happen. So tracking is also called, they're trying to make it a nicer sounding name, called streaming or ability grouping. I'm sure some of you had this happen to you in grammar school, maybe later to junior high or high school. But it really happens with both math and reading in grammar school. The good readers are in one group and they go with one teacher to one classroom, and the average readers in another, and then the poor readers in another, and they give them names like bluebirds and things. Of course, everyone knows in school who's the good readers, the smart kids, and math, same thing, who's just average and who's not so good because they're in Mrs. Who's class. So that's tracking. Can you see how that affects one's self-esteem as a child? Almost immediately. They do not do that in European and Scandinavian schools. They do not do ability grouping in that way or tracking. And here's the other thing. It can be based on test scores, but also on perceived ability, what the teacher thinks of you. And so much of what teachers think of students has to do with gender, race, ethnicity, social class. Okay. So tracking, as you can tell from what I just said, I'm sure, creates and reinforces inequality. So high-track students go into classes that involve critical thinking and problem solving and creativity. And those are the very characteristics that high-status jobs require, of course. And low-tracking students are limited to classes that have very simple skills and emphasize punctuality and conformity, which are required by lower-status jobs. The high-track students get more homework, better instruction, more enthusiastic teachers. So the result is that self-identification, as I talked about, self-esteem, self-identity, which is they view themselves as bright or capable, And the low track students view themselves as the opposite. Why bother? Why even go to school? Why study? And in middle school, it gets even more stratified, as I'm sure you can remember, with gifted students, honors classes, talented and gifted, advanced courses, etc. So that's tracking. Labeling becomes what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Students live up or down to the expectations that teachers and the educational institution have of them. So this is elementary school student engagement. Only 1 in 14 elementary school children have a chance of being in a school that encourages their engagement. I have to repeat that because it's just shocking and awful. Only 1 in 14 elementary school children have a chance of being in a school that encourages their engagement. You can't learn anything if you're bored all day. It's a long time you have to be in school. It's a long time you got to be sitting listening, There has to be a way, an effort to be sure that the children are engaged. And that just doesn't happen, except for 1 in 14 schools. So the research shows that few high school students are actively engaged either. And college undergraduates spend more time, you folks, undergraduates, through research, more time partying, socializing, and working than studying. College undergraduates study an average, this is an average from research, right? 14 hours a week, compared with 24 hours a week in 1961, and what the faculty says you need to be doing, which is 24 to 30 hours a week to really do well. So it's that labeling and tracking stuff is really deadly. It really, really is. And I wish our schools would stop doing it. But it's kind of easy, way to just label kids and put them in these different streams and you affect people's lives doing that long term. Remember I said at the very beginning, you can overcome all of that. You have to know that that was imposed on you and not necessarily your worth or your skills or your abilities. And then B, you have to do the work to restore that self-esteem and find out what you're passionate about and what you care about and what you're interested in learning. That's so important. Okay, so current issues in U.S. education. So there's huge gaps between, one public school and another public school. And we're not even going to get into private schools at this point. But once again, this has to do with schools that have resources, financial resources, which means they can pay teachers more, they recruit the best teachers, and schools who can't. So children who read proficiently by the end of the 3rd grade, if you've had the opportunity and the support to do that, both at home and at school, to learn to read proficiently by the 3rd grade, by the end of the 3rd grade, those students are much more likely to do well in all subjects and to graduate from high school. Doing your homework also affects test scores in a very positive way. And ineffective, I wrote down lousy in my notes, lousy teaching, ineffective teaching, bored teachers who don't even know the knowledge, which it often happens. They'll assign a teacher to teach something that they're not familiar with. It's not what they studied in school. That dramatically affects students as well. In high schools, among 65 countries, the United States 15-year-olds ranked 30th in math. This is out of 65 countries. Okay, we ranked 30th in math, 23rd in science, and 20th in reading. And the major difference is what I was just talking about, lousy teaching. The major difference is teacher preparation and quality. So other countries, like Finland is an example they give you, they accept only the very top applicants for teaching. So the top 5 to 30% of graduates get to go into those courses in college. Only 10% for math, science, and reading are getting to go into those courses in college and then graduate to become, if they're becoming teachers. Okay. And U.S. teachers preparation, I love this terminology, an industry of mediocrity. There's very, very low standards. Now that's been attempted to be improved, and now you need a master's in education, I believe, in Oregon. I meant to look that up before I started talking to you today. But still, the standards are so low compared to European and particularly Scandinavian countries. Finland has the best educational system in the world right now, public, K through 12 educational system. So many U.S. teachers in some states, not Oregon, but don't even have bachelor's degrees or higher in the subjects that they teach. And this is a really sad example. 30% of high school math teachers didn't major in math. And I'm sure they're as bored teaching it as the rest of all of us were listening to them teach it, right? Okay. You have to love math to major in math. And if you love something, then you have enthusiasm and energy and ways of teaching that are interesting to people to listen to. Okay. So of course there are one of the major issues in education today is the controversy over SATs, ACTs, and AP scores. So that's, once again, it's one of those things where all of those scores are a form of credentialism and privilege, and so generally people who went to good schools from upper social classes, et cetera, do well on those. The U.S. also, the graduation rate is an issue. We have the lowest college graduation rates in the industrialized world. Only 59% of full-time four-year college students completed bachelor's degrees within 6 years. That's only 9% more than half, right? So only 59% completed bachelor's degrees in the United States within 6 years, not 4 years, but 6 years, and only 41% in 4 years. Okay. The issues with the time are, well, in 6 years you could get a master's degree for the same amount of money as you spent getting a bachelor's degree, same amount of time and money that you spent 4 years. So that's the main issue there. And then that feeds right into our huge crisis of student loan debt, which hopefully will be addressed soon. So on that note, I'll leave you and see you next week.